What a field day for the heat down there. 1,000 people in the street singing songs and they carry inside. Mostly saying hooray for our side. These battle lines being drawn. Nobody's right if everybody wrong. When people speak in their mind, getting so much resistance from behind. We got to stop the children, what's that sound? Everybody look, it's going down.
Hello, this is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I am with my guests, and only one of them you can see by camera, and that's Kevin. Susie, unfortunately, we couldn't figure out how to get her camera to work, but Kevin Gosztola is the managing editor of shadowproof.com, and he's also the host of the weekly podcast, Unauthorized Disclosure. And Susie Shannon is a friend of mine, as well as a California DNC member. In 2016, she was the only California DNC member who supported Bernie. And so far, same situation until more people declare themselves. Susie also was the political director for the Sanders campaign in California, and she's a homeless advocate. Kevin wrote an article about how Tom Perez is rigging this by appointing dozens of lobbyists, corporate consultants, think tank board members, and former officials linked to the campaigns of Obama and Hillary to the various committees of the DNC. And he wrote this in the Grayzone project. It was an exclusive for them. And he did some great investigative work into their backgrounds. Now, The Hill wrote an article about this, and the DNC chair said that these members, they look for policy experts to help shape the platform, or for experienced Democratic hands who know their way around party bylaws to assist in the rules and credentialing process. But your research shows otherwise. Kevin, would you like to describe some of these people and why you're concerned about them?
I'm concerned because I do not believe that the people who were appointed to the committees are just being appointed because they know their way around the processes of the DNC's the three committees, or because they're really good at policy and they care about the issues. We know for a fact, if you look into these people's backgrounds, that they are involved in lobbying firms, or that in some instances, although not all of them are this way, but that you can identify people who are actually working for corporations currently. One example is Daniel C. Gray, who is a senior vice president, chief legal officer, and corporate secretary for the Blue Cross North Carolina leadership team. And she is going to serve as a vice chair for the platform committee. And I just don't think somebody who is working for a corporation should be on any of these committees. It doesn't seem like that conflict of interest should be allowed. You have people like Maria Cardona, who is working with, who is going to co-chair the Rules Committee with Barney Frank. We can talk about both of them very quickly here because Maria Cardona works for a firm called the Dewey Square Group. And there are two other individuals that are on committees that are part of the Dewey Square Group. And the Dewey Square Group has been reported on by The Intercept. They have worked for corporate interests to undermine progressive reforms, including expanding healthcare to cover more individuals to make sure people have universal coverage. You have Barney Frank is on the Signature Bank New York board of directors. And Barney has been very hostile to Bernie Sanders, even writing in 2015 about why progressives should not support Bernie Sanders. But he's on this bank. I don't know if a lot of people know, but in 2018, New York Times did an investigation into this bank and found it was a go-to lender to President Donald Trump's family, as well as Jared Kushner's family. And I don't know if somebody who has that in their resume should be a part of leading the matters of business for these committees. So those are just some examples to throw out there. I think they pose some really significant issues for people who are DNC members.
Now, Susie, you are on the DNC. So according to The Hill, these announcements were made on Friday, the start of a weekend, for the vote that was going to be on the Saturday. And a lot of people didn't know about them. Now, Perez says this is how it's always done. What do you think about the process by which these nomination or these appointments were made?
Well, I mean, I think there should be more disclosure. I think there should be more transparency so that we know ahead of time. So I didn't get to vote on that. It was the executive board. I'm not on the executive board of the DNC, so it was the executive board that got to vote. But most of these votes are rubber stamp votes. It's at the chair's discretion who is appointed to these committees as our DNC representatives on these committees. And so it's kind of a mystery in terms of what that process is. Is it because of relationships? Is it because of ideology? Is it because of experience? Is it all of this? Does diversity come into this? So it's a mystery. I mean, I'm a DNC member, and I think there are other DNC members that I've spoken with where they just feel like these names come out and you kind of rubber stamp them. And it's the same for our standing committees within the DNC.
Yeah, I want to just read a couple of comments from The Hill from other Sanders DNC members. The subject of transparency and notice has been broached in the past with Chairman Perez. In open meetings of the full DNC, said Terry Tucker, a DNC member from Colorado and a Sanders supporter. Lack of transparency and input from the members continues to be a source of irritation. And Jerry Shepard, also a DNC member from Colorado and a Sanders supporter, worried that the process would, quote, undermine unity, unquote, in the run-up to the convention. And you know how important unity is, folks. I mean, Elizabeth Warren can't speak more highly of unity, even after she did what she did to Bernie, but that's a whole other story. Jerry says, it will be difficult to have credible messaging to our grassroots base that the convention process will be fair and reflect the will of the voters, Shepard said. If the voters do not trust the process, that will serve to dampen turnout and also will hurt our down ticket races. So he said they were passed along to the members at the same time they always were. And Andrew Worthman, a DNC member from Wisconsin who was not endorsed in 2020, but represented Sanders on the Rules Committee in 2016, said the appointments were a missed opportunity for the National Party to seek input from the rank and file. Quote, we have to do things differently. This is one of those things where people were looking to the party to build trust in community, and we just have to do a better job. So obviously, we're starting off on the wrong foot with the same kind of suspicions about the DNC. And when I first read about this, Susie, I asked you if there was anything we could do about this, and you replied back, done deal. So can you explain about that fatalistic viewpoint, but also what you told us about how we can make changes as the process moves along?
Sure. So done deal means that it's been voted on, and readdressing this before the convention is not necessarily a possibility in terms of meeting scheduled or even a way within our rules to readdress the appointments. So that is a problem. So I do want to give credit to Amr Shergill, who is the chair of our Progressive Caucus for the California Democratic Party, because he pointed out that there should be at least one rules change. And so, like I said, the process itself is a mystery, but there are some policy changes that I think we can enact. one of which was Amar's idea, and he came up, he wrote a letter through the Progressive Caucus asking people to sign on to it, which I've been organizing within the DNC, to basically say that as part of our policy, we will exclude from these committees, particularly the Rules Committee, anyone who serves as a paid staffer or paid consultant to a presidential candidate. And part of the reason for that is that the Rules Committee makes a lot of decisions about how the convention is run, and that can include also who is seated as delegates, or what proportion that is if there's controversy like we had in 2008. So we definitely want, we don't want the appearance of impropriety. We don't want the appearance of putting our thumb on the scale. We wanted to, particularly for the Rules Committee, we wanted to be as impartial as possible. And that's not to say that people don't come to the table with their biases, but if you're a paid staffer, a paid consultant, that's a lot different because you are acting in the interest of the candidate. And I've been a paid staffer, for a presidential candidate just recently, and you are acting on behalf of the campaign. So I think that kind of vetting and that kind of policy change is needed for sure.
But this is all in the future, right? This isn't going to affect this convention.
It won't affect this. And I think the concern, because, I've been trying to make the Democratic Party more progressive since 2005, right? So the concern here, or the question, I think, for most progressives who are very frustrated, because we tend not to get the appointments, right? The question really is, how do we make it more progressive at this point? And there is a way, which is that each of the presidential candidates, based on the proportion of the vote that they get in the primaries, will also have appointees. So, for instance, if Sanders were to get the highest percentage of votes out of the state primaries and caucuses that are coming up, then he would have that proportion of delegates who would be appointed to these committees. So that means that even with the chair's appointments, progressives could still just do people power, right? Because it's always harder for us. It always comes back to the people power. Just through sheer people power, we could actually take over every single one of these committees as progressives and have our agenda on the table in the platform committee, have our agenda on the table in terms of making the rules more fair, have our people on in credentials, and it would be based on the will of the voters. And that's how you fix it. You fix it through sheer democracy.
Well, I want to go back a little bit to 2016 and the platform committee, because I think Kevin made a good point in his article that these people on the committee affect really the platform that Bernie is going to be dealing with. Now, we all know that the platform is, a lot of people have minimized the platform by saying it's only worth the piece of paper it's written on. And we've seen, Susie, here in California, how long it's been part of the Democratic Party platform to ban fracking, and still we can't get, we couldn't get Jerry Brown to do it for 8 years. We haven't been able to get Newsom to do it, although he did do a moratorium on new fracking permits. But Kevin, talk about how you feel these particular, and you may want to tell us the backgrounds of some of these, go into some more of who these people are and how they could affect Bernie's platform, and how, just like Hillary's people affected Bernie's platform in the areas of trade and Israel-Palestine and the environment.
Well, I should say that I appreciate Susie keeping everything in perspective, because all of these appointees amount to about 15% of the people that are ultimately going to be on these committees. So that's something for people to keep in mind. And the people who were initially appointed by Perez to this platform committee are possibly going to be in the minority depending on what happens with the vote state by state. You have people, though, on the platform committee who are questionable because of who they are, because you have people, the chair, co-chairs are like people who have been involved in certain issues, worked for companies. Dennis McDonough is a co-chair for the platform committee, and he in fact has been part of this Rework America task force that has a connection to the Boeing Corporation, is working with this coalition, and the other founding members in this task force are corporations themselves that have particular interests that may go against the kind of working class policies that Sanders might want to propose. You have other individuals who are on the platform committee, like, Carol Browner and Wendy Sherman are both people who are coming back to the platform committee. They were on this committee back in 2016. And when you talk about, Lauren, them voting down the opposition, they were not wanting to have any opposition to the Trans-Pacific Partnership in the platform, voting against the ban on fracking, voting against keeping fossil fuels in the ground, voting against a carbon tax. There was also a plank that James Zogby, who, by the way, was purged from the executive committee of the DNC by Tom Perez, he wanted to get something into the platform about addressing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, having a responsibility to just, provide some kind of aid and help Palestinian people. That was something that Bernie Sanders was willing to support. But both of these people voted against that. They're coming back to the platform committee. You have Bakari Sellers on this platform committee. He's been openly hostile to Bernie Sanders. He's been very divisive, and he constantly is suggesting that Bernie has a long way to go with Black voters when that's not true. And he's trying to make him toxic to minority groups so that people don't support him. And also, he's on the council for AIPAC, so he's part of the Israel lobby. And so I have a problem with these people, but I do think that there are some questions to ask, and maybe Susie knows based on her position in the DNC. But last time around, because of the success of the Sanders campaign, they had a platform drafting committee that ended up being composed with people who were appointed by Clinton and then also were appointed by Sanders. It seemed like there was a particular procedure that was followed that was unusual. I understand that these platform meetings happen in stages, and you have a smaller group that works at the platform, and then it goes to a larger committee, and then until finally you get to the convention where it's going to approve the wider platform. Like last time they had St. Louis meeting, they had an Orlando meeting, and then you had a wider convention meeting. So I don't know what's going to happen this time around. And it's not clear to me how much power and control these chairs and vice chairs have to determine what's going to be in the platform, or if most of that comes from the internal, the people who are actually in the platform committee. So if it comes up from the bottom up through the top, can people who run the platform committee say, well, I don't want to have Medicare for all be on the agenda. We're going to keep that out of the platform committee discussion.
Do you know the answer to that question?
Yeah, so the way that it's drafted, my understanding is that there are smaller subcommittees too that work on various parts of different planks. So you'll have people who just work on housing, you'll have people who just work on healthcare, and then they will submit that to the platform committee. A lot of it will be vetted through the presumptive nominee or the nominee if we have a clear nominee, because that person obviously will have the most number of appointments on the platform committee. So they sort of tend to get their way, right? So there was a lot of frustration because I know that there were some progressive policies that were moved, And it just didn't drive with the Clinton campaign and what they were looking for. And so there was a lot of contention. But I think the most brilliant part of that whole platform process was when Russell Green got up and introduced an amendment, I think it was an amendment, into the on climate change, into the environmental plank. And he was able to do that. I think it had been like a last minute decision that they let him do this. And he just got up and made it. And I thought it was great because I felt so good about having like a progressive leader on that platform committee who was able to do that. So I thought that was great. And I remember, Cornel West was on the platform committee, and Keith Ellison helped to draft some of the housing policies. We had a pretty good plank on housing policies. I know that Barbara Lee and Keith Ellison had worked on that, so I was fairly happy with that. And I do think, you could use, fracking obviously as an example of how platforms are not necessarily going to lead to legislation. But I do think that platforms show what the trends are. And platforms also do get implemented as legislation eventually. So I've gone through a lot of national platforms. The platform in, I believe it was 1976, it was either 76 or 80, had welfare reform in it, which we ended up implementing in the 1990s. In the 1940s, there was a minority, as part of the minority plank, they wanted desegregation of the military. And there was a huge protest on the floor, and they basically were able to convince everyone that this, not everyone, but a majority of the people there at the convention to adopt that. And the Southern delegation walked out, literally just walked out. And the Northern delegation got it, and we got, I think within a few years, we got desegregation of the military. So I think the platform is important. I think that we can use it. It's how you use it as a tool, but you can, certainly bring that to any congressional representative and say, look, this is in the Democratic Party platform. We need legislation. Does that mean the legislation is going to necessarily pass? I don't know, because it depends on what it is, but it shows a trend and where our nation is going. And I think it's really important. And I think it's, how we express ourselves coming out of that convention and what we support can be a game changer. And I would use the Trans-Pacific Partnership as an example of that, because I remember walking into the Democratic Party convention 4 years ago, and I was really upset because we were to the right of the Republican Party on trade, because they had said they were against the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and we walked in there with a neutral position. And I can't help but think that that was a huge part of us having a lot of problems in the Midwest.
Right. And,
not only had we been for NAFTA, but then we were neutral on TPP, but our president at the time supported it, brought it forward, and was really pushing it. And it makes it much harder in the Midwest when you have a family with 3 generations, in their family of people who haven't been able to get work or decent pay because they've lost jobs, to make the case that they should vote for the Democrat.
Right. Well, this was the Hightower Amendment, which basically was so simple. It was so simple. All it said was that Obama should not be putting the TPP in the lame duck session of Congress. In other words, in between the time that the new president was announced and the end of his office. We just thought that was so important. And he was so tone deaf, pushing the TPP during the entire campaign season. And then, of course, Hillary didn't go to Wisconsin, and she lost all those states that Bernie won in the primaries. And that's why a lot of people don't know this, so I'm going to say it on the air right now. We delegates really were not happy about being told we had to stay in $700 a night hotel rooms to just go for a Hillary coronation. we were told by Bernie that there would be a contested convention, and then he decided not to 2 weeks before he endorsed Hillary. Then we were told that he was going to introduce all these minority planks on the floor of the convention, one of them which was the Hightower Amendment about the TPP. And then we found out when we got there that he wasn't going to introduce them because he wanted to reserve his powder for a floor fight on the rules, meaning the rules about the superdelegates. And then at the Rules Committee meeting the night before, you know, he gave that up because Barney Frank, who was once again co-chairing the Rules Committee, railroaded, you know, every amendment or proposal that Bernie delegates wanted on that Rules Committee, railroaded it. You know, basically the Hillary delegates were all told to say, you know, I haven't had time to read it. This is not the venue where we should be supporting it. And then there was one other thing that they kept saying, I can't remember what it is now. And then they finally adjourned that meeting. They took the Bernie delegates into another room and basically told them about the Unity Reform Commission. And the Unity Reform Commission, I was very skeptical about because it, you know, the recommendations were not mandatory. They were just recommendations. And Bernie delegates were outnumbered. I mean, Bernie appointees were outnumbered by Hillary appointees and DNC appointees. So I was pleasantly surprised when they reported out that they were going to get rid of superdelegates on the first ballot. Now we just have them in the second ballot, which is why I think, you know, I want to talk about the brokered convention next. But, you know, we had a plan. You know, when I found out that they weren't going to introduce these minority planks, I wrote an article in Roots Action, which is Norman Solomon's website, basically saying we got to have this conference call about what we're going to do. So we had a conference call. There were 127 delegates on it. And we had three options. One, we were going to try to prevail on Dan Malloy, chairman of the Platform Committee, to introduce these minority planks. And the rationale was going to be, you know, we thought Sanders was going to do it. That didn't work. So then we tried to find a state chair who would introduce it from the floor using the microphone. That didn't work. So our third thing, which we did do, was we were going to mic check it. And that was when somebody from the Platform Committee got to the podium. And the first time they said the word platform, we were going to go mic check, mic check, mic check. And then we shouted, no TPP. And it was great. I mean, it was the only time that, well, we also shouted ban fracking now and no more war. And of course, the Hillary delegates were told to shout over us, USA, USA, which is the exact chant they use, you know, at the Trump rallies. But had we not done that, you know, it would have just been like some big party for Hillary. And I really feel like that these conventions have lost what they used to be about. You know, there used to be a lot of fighting on the floor. There used to be a lot of unknowns that would only get decided once you got to the floor of the convention. And now it's all pre-scripted and sponsored by Verizon and Comcast. And it's very, you know, it's very upsetting. So I'm worried that one of the reasons that we had so many candidates coming in here is to make sure that Bernie could not win, you know, on the first ballot. So I want to know what either of you thinks about that. And what is it that Barney Frank could do as chairman of the Rules Committee to hinder Bernie at that point, should it go to a second ballot?
Well, if it goes to a second ballot, everyone is released, including the pledged delegates. And you bring in super delegates. So I would have a vote. Congressional representatives would have a vote, and it just kind of becomes like the wild, wild west. So it's a little problematic. I mean, I was against super delegates having a vote even on the second ballot. I mean, I voted for the super delegate reform because it was the best. It was really the only rule that was presented. But what I preferred was to get rid of this voting on the first ballot or the second ballot, where you can still put your thumb on the scale, and congressional representatives get to sort of pick, and they can choose outside of the will of the voters. And so what I was proposing was that we get rid of the superdelegate system altogether and allow candidates to increase the number of at-large and pleo, which are party leader and elected officials, those delegates, which are pledged delegates to the candidate in proportion to how the voters in that particular state voted. So it is democratic, and it's representative of the will of the voters. So that's what I was more looking for. So I think if we do have a brokered convention this time or any time in the future, we'll be back to square one. And people will say, wait a minute, all these people put their thumb on the scale and it wasn't representative of the voters. So we still have a problem. It's still in a fairly unfair system just on the second ballot. So I am hopeful. I'm a Bernie Sanders endorser and supporter, and I'm hopeful that people will come out and vote for him and that he will be the nominee and we will get this on the first ballot and not have to worry about a second ballot. And, I think he has momentum and it's becoming his to lose. So for every single problem that we're talking about here, because there's so much power in the nominee, every single problem that we're talking about here goes away for progressives if Bernie wins.
You mean on the first ballot?
On the first ballot. If Bernie wins on the first ballot, the makeup of our committees will be different because he will be able to appoint to those committees. The makeup of our platform will be different. How we move forward with the DNC will look different. And basically, he becomes president, he controls the DNC.
Right. What do you think of the whole idea of a brokered convention and what's going to happen when it goes to a second ballot? Have you given that any thought, Kevin?
I've given varying answers, but after talking with you here and listening to Susie, I kind of favor the optimism of uncertainty, which is that we don't know what is going to happen. And that could be very good for us because people are right now convincing themselves that the worst case scenarios could play out, but we very well might surprise ourselves. We've seen in the last couple of days really good polling coming out of Texas, as well as California, where Susie is, in terms of how Sanders is performing against Joe Biden and these other candidates. It's very possible that he does extremely well in the Iowa caucus. It's possible that he wins New Hampshire, and winning Iowa and New Hampshire would put him on a very good path towards winning. Now, you do have this fact that Michael Bloomberg is funding this campaign that seems to be there to disrupt Bernie's effort to become the nominee, form an alliance with Biden, and maybe hand over delegates to him and help put him over as his campaign becomes weaker and weaker. But I would like to point out that if we go back to 2019, there's a fair amount of disorganization that has existed among the more moderate center, the centrist, the corporate part of the Democratic Party. People like, ideologically, you would put Amy Klobuchar, you would put Michael Bennett, you would put Hickenlooper, you would put these candidates into that faction of not knowing who exactly they were going to coalesce around and be that candidate that was more close to the politics of Hillary Clinton, more like the New Democrats that have been so powerful within the Democratic Party. If you go all the way back to the 1980s, pushing for those policies like NAFTA, pushing for the crime bill that Joe Biden gets hit with all the time, pushing for a kind of austerity measures where you balance the budget and you in order to balance the budget, you make some modest cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But there hasn't really been this coalition around a candidate. You've seen a better organizing apparatus. You've seen more of a coalition around Bernie, and he's really solidified among the left his power. And actually, it's been to the detriment of Elizabeth Warren because there's been so much organizing around Bernie Sanders. So I would just say that anything's possible. Worst case scenarios are possible, but what Susie's saying, and it is a persuasive case for us to keep our hope because there's a lot that we can do immediately to shut all of this down. And I do sense that there's a lot of panic among the establishment. If you just look at media in the past week, there are at least a dozen stories that we could go through that have been put out to try and attack Bernie. And each one seems more ridiculous than the next.
Yes, and that was my show. That was my show on Sunday night. We attacked 3 of those articles.
Yeah.
We went through it.
And that to me just indicates the panic. I mean, the one that sticks out in my head that is the most ridiculous thing was a columnist for Washington Post, Max Boot, saying that he had once changed his view. He has changed his views. Bernie has never changed his views. I changed my view because I was wrong about the Iraq War. Because Bernie was right about the Iraq War, we shouldn't trust him because he's been too right about everything. And that the most insane thing I've ever heard. That some politician has been too right, too consistent, so you shouldn't. They're running out of ideas in terms of like going after. And you'll notice that, you know, what they do now is they don't have anything against him, so they whisper that there must be opposition research out there that someone's going to find that's going to drag, like they're going to find some kind of dirty law.
Did you see the thing today? They're talking about he compared George Wallace to Hitler.
It's a total lie. It's a total lie because the whole thing, if you read it, he basically was treating George Wallace like Donald Trump. We were talking about these attacks and how they're running out of ideas, and you know what they have left is basically to target supporters, to try and go after the people who Bernie has absolutely no control over.
Yeah.
And that's going to be used to try to divide. But also, we can see in these attempts how desperate they are to get something to stick so that they can drag this campaign because it's become such a juggernaut.
Well, you know what was disconcerting to me last night, and I'm spending a lot more time on Twitter, probably too much time on Twitter. It's very irritating, not good for my blood pressure. But, you know, to see Roe tweet out about what a wonderful conversation he had with, you know, Zerlina Maxwell and Jess McIntosh, and how we need to have civility in our campaigning. And then people were writing like, why are you, including me, before I even read his next tweet, why are you talking to those two? Those two have been the worst Bernie smearers of anyone out there. And, you know, just basically being polite to him in the way we were addressing him because we love Ro Khanna, but just questioning, you know. And then, so then he writes another tweet that's about civility again, and judging by the responses to this tweet. And in other words, he, instead of defending us, he was like taking their side. And I just thought that was terrible, terrible. Now, Nina Turner doesn't do that. Somebody was asking in the comments here, you know, what her response was. And she was on Status Quo, which is Jordan Chariton's show. And she said, if the DNC believes it's going to get away in 2020 with what it did in 2016, it has another thing coming. And that's Nina Turner. The California, I read that on Sunday, the DNC members from California, which includes you, Susie, sent a letter to Perez asking that paid employees or consultants to the presidential campaigns be excluded from the Rules Committee. I want to ask Kevin, if you looked through any of these, since you did such great research into who these people are any of them paid employees or consultants to the presidential campaigns that you could discern?
Well, I'm not certain that any of them are currently working for the campaigns, but what you can say is someone like Keisha Lance Bottoms, who is the mayor of Atlanta, she has endorsed Biden, and she's actually gone on television as a surrogate to speak on behalf of his campaign. So I don't know if she should have a vice chair position on a rules committee when she has to be neutral. And certainly, you could see the potential for these people. I just look at all of the people who are chairs and vice chairs of these 3 committees who are going to be in control. And if I understand this correctly, will remain in control regardless of whether Bernie Sanders becomes the nominee. If they aren't on his side in terms of his agenda, they can frustrate it. They can be nuisances. They can undermine what people are trying to do to organize. And that might be the best that they've got. That might be the only thing they can do for the people who they're serving. But Sanders doesn't have a single person involved in managing these committees. So I don't know if the nominee would have any ability to switch out people and get some kind of representation. But it seems completely unfair given what happened with the 2016 election and how he had 46% of pledged delegates. And if he's going to have such a strong showing, you would think that the management of these committees should be more representative of the influence that his campaign is having on the party from the grassroots level on up. So there aren't really anybody that are working for the campaign. I mean, Julie Chavez Rodriguez is a co-chair. She was working for Kamala Harris's campaign, but that shut down. So I don't really view that as that much of a significant issue. It would have been if she was still campaigning. But all of these people here, it's important to point out, nearly all of these people, with the exception of maybe 10 of these 93 people who were appointed, endorsed Hillary Clinton back in 2016. And I just think in terms of this constant talk about unity, unity works both ways. It's not just forcing Bernie Sanders people to be nice to Hillary Clinton supporters. Hillary Clinton supporters haven't been that respectful of Bernie Sanders people. And because of the animosity between people, I can't see the justification for stacking these committees with so many people who have allegiances to a campaign. And with the kind of bad blood that exists around the 2016 campaign, there's no way you can say with a straight face that this doesn't have rippling effects through the 2020 primary, that people have been able to put this behind them. There's still people who hold grudges. I mean, we've seen Hillary, nobody likes him, Clinton come out here and stir the pot. And all of these people who worked for the Clinton campaign, unfortunately, since Bernie announced, because you had people like Philip Raines, who was going on MSNBC and stirring things up. Bakari Sellers is on this platform committee, and he said he didn't have any problem with Bernie Sanders getting in the race. The biggest question was, when will he get out? And it's just like, it's obnoxious. And these people are on these committees, and how can you expect them to be good faith actors who participate in the process and aren't trying to undermine what people are trying to build?
Well, the worst one is Barney Frank. I mean, I was in that committee, as I mentioned earlier, and I was arguing with some Hillary delegates who said, or appointees, that, you know, Bernie never got anything done and he wasn't a Democrat. And I started telling them how he was the amendment king, and Barney Frank came over. This was during a break. And I asked Barney, I said, Barney, tell these guys that Bernie was the amendment king. And, you know, and he said, well, those amendments that he got passed were really inconsequential. And then I said, well, what about how he uses the bully pulpit? And he said, oh, yeah, he said some good things, but we're glad he's finally joined our party after all these years to actually make a difference. You know, just negative, derisive comments about Bernie Sanders. And so bad back then that the Sanders, according to this article, they tried to have him removed from the Rules Committee, describing him as, quote, an aggressive attack surrogate for the Clinton campaign. Now, I don't understand why there was one person they tried to have removed, that Perez would make this guy the co-chair. And I don't know who he's going to be for, but I can guarantee you he's going to be for anybody but Bernie. Do you have any thoughts on that, Susie?
You know, as I said before, for these appointments, it's the chair's discretion, and it's pretty much rubber stamped by the executive board of the DNC. And I think that's why, you know, we need to look at changes in policy, but the process needs to be looked at as well. Because if you're on the Rules Committee, and I'm not singling out Barney Frank because there's, you know, other people also on the Rules Committee where, you know, there's just explicit bias against a candidate. And if somebody is showing explicit bias, and everyone's going to come into these committees with some kind of bias, right? Even progressives, they're going to be biased toward more progressive candidates and biased toward a more progressive platform. But if you're showing explicit like hostility, almost to the point of where you're making violent comments, that is problematic if you're on the rules committee, which should always have the appearance of impartiality. And also the people who are appointed should have good judgment, and maybe not be making, comments in public that are so negative and potentially violent against a specific candidate. And so these are all the things.
Who said the violent thing and what was the thing that was said?
Well, I think there was something reported in a newspaper that Podesta was talking about Bernie Sanders and in I think it was one of the leaked emails, and said, "Where should I put the knife?" That to me is an extremely violent comment, and definitely shows explicit bias.
Yeah.
And if they want him to be part of the process because of whatever relationship he has with the chair, then maybe the rules committee wasn't the best committee for him to be on, right? So I'm just saying, all of this, though, like I said, it's at the discretion of the chair. And the way that we beat this back is the way we always beat this back as progressives, which is people power and democracy, and to take over these committees. Because it'd be interesting to have a progressive nominee for a change, and then to see how people think, what people think about the rules then.
We've just about reached the end of our time for the show. So I just wanted to ask either of you if you had any closing comments you want to make before we end the show.
Well, my comment would be, if you want to change the Democratic National Committee, phone and walk for Bernie, overwhelm, the polls, get out and vote, get everybody that to vote, because that is how we win. That's how we take the presidency, but that's also how we win back the Democratic National Committee, and that's how we'll be in power there.
I suppose I'll be a little boring and just mention that this is something that I'm going to continue to be watching closely as far as what happens with the DNC and any alleged examples of how they might be putting their thumb on the scale to tip it against Bernie, to make it harder. We've seen things like in BuzzFeed recently reported it covered this exit package that Tom Perez might be getting, and because of the way it was reported and who particularly was involved, there's a couple of people who are corporate Democrats who have been involved in lobbying efforts, that it just didn't look really good for the DNC. So it seems like it's been put on hold for the time being. Again, you have, I think, total dysfunction at the top. And it's very clear to me that, I don't know, Susie might disagree, but it just seems like there are people running the show that aren't telling people at the bottom what they are doing in the DNC right now. So it's an important moment for people like myself to be paying attention and trying to put everything together so the public can make sense of what is happening. Not to promote unfounded conspiracies, but to actually put out facts and to point out who these people are and to show examples that can be proven as to why what is going on is highly questionable. I think the vigilance that people have is just going to energize voters even more. I mean, I think the thing that we've seen time and time again with the Sanders campaign, and this goes all the way back to 2016, is that almost with every attack, they actually get stronger because it energizes people. It makes people more loyal. It makes people more interested in serving and boosting the campaign. I think if you read Jeff Weaver's book, How Bernie Won, about the 2016 campaign, I believe there's a part in there where he talks about how these Clinton attacks that were happening against Bernie were almost welcome because they were times that they were actually getting some of the best fundraising out of their campaign.
Democratic Israel Majority, whatever it's called, ran an ad against Bernie in Iowa, and he raised $1.3 million the next day.
Right.
So,
So that's what I had to close.
all right. Well, I want to thank you both for being on the show. Even though we couldn't see you, Susie, we heard you fine, and we really appreciate what you have to say. And Kevin, keep writing those great articles. We'll be looking forward to them. And I'm going to put the link to his shadowproof.com website in the comments. So I'm going to just go to myself right now so I can promote an upcoming show. But thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. So I just got news that I'm going to probably be doing an event with Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty, because they're going to be coming out to California on February 7th to do something with Jimmy Dore, which is sold out. So I'm going to do an event at my home, and they have a new book that they're promoting. And for people who don't know, they host a show called Rising on The Hill TV, which is The Hill is a magazine, online magazine, and now they have this TV show, and they've just got a tremendous number of subscribers in the year that they've started. And she's considered a pro Bernie journalist, which I definitely think she is. Page Six tried to do a smear on her the other day by posting that in her book she talked about how she tried to work for Biden. She was letting her fans know on Twitter that they were coming out with this, and this was nothing that she was trying to hide. In fact, it was in her book. So again, like Kevin was saying, they're now going after the Bernie supporters. So I'm going to be doing this event in my house. Anyone in Los Angeles who's viewing who wants to come, message me on Facebook. And we haven't worked out the details yet, but it's going to also involve Cenk Uygur, who is a candidate that I support. He's running for Congress in California's 25th district against an establishment Democrat by the name of Christy Smith, who doesn't support Medicare for all. It's a very conservative district, and I'm anxious to talk to Cenk about how he plans to win in that district. So that's it for now. I want to say thanks to everyone for watching, and keep fighting.